Welcome to my tutorial of drawing the Australian bush in pen and ink and painting it in ink and watercolour wash. Now, I've been asked about this technique that I'm using. It's not my normal technique at all. I've mainly been an oil painter through my gallery exhibiting years and purist watercolour where I've only used the watercolour wash, or I've used a lot of soft pastels in recent years. But I've come to love working with fountain pens because it's very practical if you're a person who's moving around a lot, as I am at the moment, or if you're finding yourself in small places to work. I'm sitting with my husband a lot through the day, and where I'm sitting, I can't put up a lot of equipment. In my studio at night, of course, I can spread myself out, and that's ideal for doing the wash work. But through the day, it's just lovely to just be carrying a few fountain pens around. I like fountain pens because, again, if I'm working in rooms where, I might be over carpet, I mightn't be wanting to work with open bottles of ink and dip pens. There's always a risk of a spill, but with a good quality fountain pen, you've got the ink in the reservoir and you can work for ages just sketching away happily with plenty of ink flow. And I like to work with a quality nib, so I'm tending to either buy a good quality pen in the first place with a, say, 14 karat gold nib, or a really flexible pen nib, and I'm looking to buy a pen that has a reservoir built into the pen itself. You may pay a little bit more for the pen with a piston fill or a bladder fill than you would for these pens. The modern day pens, you tend to buy disposable cartridges that go in the pens, but you need to weigh it up. Are you going to be using your pen a lot? In which case your piston fill is going to hold much more ink and you're not going to be having to stop and refill frequently, and it's just better economy than buying disposable cartridges. I've moved on to the fountain pen from starting with the disposable pens. Now, I'm investing many hours into these works. In fact, what I'm doing is a main painting and two smaller vertical paintings to hang either side. So I'm actually creating a triptych of three paintings that will coordinate and go together of this painting. I'm using the same technique for the two smaller pieces, and I'm adding an extra medium into the larger work. So the first two small ones will be pen and wash, and the third one will be a mixed medium where I introduce gouache, and I'll explain as I go. I start the drawing usually with a extra fine point black nib, and I'm working mainly with the Lamy 2000 pens for the broader lines, and I'm working with a medium and a broad. I've used the broad one where I have written out the Boots Gully where I want a wider line. Now here I'm using a pure sable brush. I wet the paper so that when I put the brushwork down it bleeds out, because I don't want to have tight edges everywhere. I used the pen where I wanted the tight edges for doing the branch work. Now that's a little teddy bear in a boot that's right in the foreground there beneath the Boots Gully. People have a wonderful sense of humour, and I guess it's been called Boots Gully because it might have been owned by somebody called Boots, and people have hung their old boots in the area. When you're painting dense bush like this, you've got a wonderful opportunity to demonstrate aerial perspective. Now, aerial perspective is the layers of air between you and what you're looking at. So, for instance, if the sky is blue, this is a simplification of it, but let's say the sky is blue and your foreground might be made up of greens and browns and bright lemons or something like that, all sorts of contrasts of bright colour, but back in the distance you've got this milky blue sky. So what you would do is you would paint your sky colour in, you'd paint your foreground colour in, and your middle distance might be a mixture of half the sky colour and half all your foreground colours. And the middle depth distance, where you're going back, say, 50% again from the middle distance through to the furthest point, you might now have 3/4 of the sky colour mixed with your foreground colour. Again, if you just step a little bit back from the foreground, you might only have 1/4 of the sky colour mixed in. So this is showing you the layers of air between you and what you're looking at. Aerial perspective is different to the lineal perspective. It's a softening of the subject. It's also putting the subject slightly out of focus as you're going back into the distance. You don't see the detail as much. So the colour's changing, the contrast of light and shade is changing, and the crispness of what you're painting is altering. There's also, of course, the lineal perspective. So where you would normally have your trees getting smaller as they're going back into the distance, if you're dealing with a gully where you're starting painting from something that is low down in the gully, the area behind may be rising up, and so you may have a situation where your distant trees are actually appearing to be taller than your foreground trees because they're going up a rise. So that's what's happening here. I have this dense bush where the tree becoming softer, more mixture of the colour of the sky, which is basically light at this point. But you have it going very soft as it goes back, and your trees are not getting shorter as they go back. They're just as tall because they're going up the hill. So it's a lovely feeling of a gully that we're capturing. Also, you're not getting a lot of light through into this scene. There's a lot of middle tones. You've got a medium light through to, say, a medium dark, even some intense darks in pockets in this gully. So there's not a great deal of contrast of light and shade. It's also very busy. It's absolutely dense with trees. It's wattle trees and box trees. It's none of these magnificent old Australian river gums, so that if you're looking for those magnificent thick trunked trees in this Australian bush scene, you're not going to get them, because you have to look at the scene and say, what is the scene telling me it looks like? That's my pear. This is my major painting that will go hang between the pear. So we're starting this one. Now, jumping to this one and describing it to you. And because it's a quirky scene, this intense bush with these boots hung around the place, I wanted to exaggerate the quirkiness, and so I actually painted this one on an angle. Maybe the person is painting it's drunk. They're not actually, but you know what I mean. It's just trying to capture the quirkiness. I could just imagine the person who might hang all these old boots around the place as a bit of a hobo, maybe staggering around a little bit, taking his photograph or his sketch sideways. So we're just trying to exaggerate the humour of the scene. I'm trying to actually learn a lot of the humour that caricaturists and cartoonists can put into this scene, rather than just try to always paint straight as I've always done. It's nice to learn new things at every age. So we're going for a little bit of humour into this. I'm working with a pure sable brush now, so it's like I started off with the fountain pen. As I said, the fountain pen is just marvellous for just carrying around through the day, being able to do your sketches through the day. You can really learn so much just by always being able to pull that art supply out of your pocket and do a quick sketch, a little bit of paint work on the spot. And then when you come back to the studio, you can sit down and do more detailed work, like with this wash work, where I need to put out water. I need to be able to keep my brushes clean, spread out a palette of paint. That's, wonderful. If you only have a little bit of time, you can put a lot into the sketch, a little bit at a time through the day, and then just sit down in that time that you've got left over in the evening, which is how I'm working at the moment, and go in with your wash work. So this watercolour wash over a pen line work is really suiting what's going on in my life at the moment. It's not that this is a style that is my usual style at all. It's what is suiting my lifestyle at the moment, and what I'm going to mainly focus on in this channel. I have created 3 other channels for if you're wanting to see other types of subjects. If you're more into flower paintings, I have a still life channel, which will also have wonderful flower paintings in. If you're more into figurative work, I've got a dog drawing channel where I will also be drawing other subjects, including people. So, and if you're more into the blog style, where you're just wanting to hear me chat about lifestyle, I have a channel for that. This one's concentrating on Australian sketchbook, which lends itself to both painting and sketching. You'll notice how, if you like, untidy the Australian bush is. Of course, this is natural to my eye. I'm an Australian, although I've travelled the world. I've been to California in particular and seen scenes very similar to this. You have a lot of eucalypts growing in California, so I felt very much at home in the Californian bushland because it had that kind of untidy, kind of scrubbery bush that I'm so used to here at my home. It's wonderful for doing these lovely twiggy types of sketches. So it comes as a bit of a shock if you're into the orderly European garden type of scenery. It's a completely different type of work to what many people are used to, where they like the orderliness of things. There's quite a movement for urban sketching at the moment, and that's where people go out with their fountain pens or their pens, that maybe the disposable kinds of pens. Again, you'll find your fountain pens will eventually save you money on buying the disposable ones. The same as a better quality fountain pen with a reservoir for the ink will save you money on buying your cheaper fountain pens where you've got to keep replacing the disposable ink cartridge. So if you're into this, if you're committing to this and find you love it like I do, then it's much better to get a quality one. I'm using the Lamy 2000. They're getting hard to get because I think they might be stopping to manufacture them. You may need to look for other brands if you can't get that one. That's my favourite. It's not necessarily the best, it's just the one that suits me. I like it. It has a very good flow of ink, so it puts down quite a lot of ink, which if you're working on a good quality paper like watercolour paper, you won't get a bleed, but you get a good dark line because of it putting out a good flow of ink. Some pens will put out less ink with each stroke. Good idea to do what I do. I joined the Australian Fountain Pen group on Facebook actually, and I asked questions and I looked and I listened and I looked things up, and if I saw a pen that I was interested in, I researched what other enthusiasts, drawing with pen enthusiasts or fountain pen enthusiasts thought of that pen. I didn't go and spend my money until I did a bit of research. Again, here's my scrubby bush. Now this one I've already started with a bit of wash, but again, remember I've got 3 of these going, so although I've started this one, I will be showing you how I start with the others. I'm trying to pull up the feeling of wattle. Now, the wattle in bloom is a lovely bright yellow. I've started with lemon yellow, then I've gone to cadmium yellow deep, and this is the really bright yellow in the foreground. But as I go back, and you can't see the colours that I put out in the palette at the top of the palette, but as I work further back into this wattle, I start dipping into yellow ochre, which is a more muted, subdued yellow, because as we go back into the bush, the brightness of the yellow will fade. So you've got your brightest colours in the foreground. This is the second of the tall paintings. As I said, 2 tall, narrow paintings and 1 wider one. And we're putting a little sky colour in now to show you. There is not just one way to paint. By doing 3 subjects, paintings of a similar subject, I can show you that you can paint them differently. It's not a case of this is how I paint, this is the only way to paint. That's a little bit of a myth that's going around in the pen and wash group. Because there are a few people who dominate pen and wash, they're very good at it. I admire their work. And a lot of people think that's how you do pen and wash. No, working with a pen and working with wash is how you do pen and wash. If your technique is different, it's still pen and wash. My technique is probably a little bit more elaborate than many people who are in the pen and wash field because, as I said, I come from it as a professional artist. I'm used to doing works that I've maybe put a minimum of 10 hours, 40 hours into a painting. So I'm not doing those little quickies. And so my work is obviously going to be different. And so I'm not trying to emulate the type of work that's dominating the pen and wash groups at the moment. Putting a bit more work into the pen work. I'm putting a lot more work into the watercolour work. As I said, the actual scene, if you were to see the photograph, there's not a lot of contrast of light and shade in the scene. You've got some intensely dark darks, and then you come through to a lot of middle tones. There's not a lot of bright lights, unfortunately, and of course the main subjects don't stand out well. Like the boots are partly hidden in the scene, as in the contrast of light and shade isn't there. You've got these brown and grey boots hanging on a rail in a bushland that's predominantly greys and browns. So there's no great contrast. So what I'm doing with these paintings is I'm leaving the painting of the boots until last. And when I do, I want to dramatise them. I want to exaggerate them. Just because they happen to be brown boots doesn't mean I have to paint them brown. If I did, if I painted them tone brown, they may not stand out well. So we've got to think about this one, but I think we'll be having maybe a splash of bright red, bright yellow, bright green in those boots hanging on the post. Also, the Boots Gully sign. I wanted to dramatise this one and have it stand out. So I am reserving, I've got a lot of brown tones, yellow brown tones in this painting. And with the Boots Gully, I'm keeping it fairly white at the moment, other than a few dark marks to represent the nails and some rusty marks on it. If I put a bit of colouring in, I'll probably give it a little bit of a blue wash because I want it to stand out different to the rest of the scene. Again, I'm just trying to capture the feeling of wattle, grasses, a bit of dry bush track, and the density of the bush. I'm wanting to try to get some very dark shadows into it, and I'm wanting to get the feeling of the bright lemon yellows of the wattle. Now the brush I'm working with is a pure sable. When I was doing wash work with the brush using the ink, I did not use my best quality pure sable because it's very difficult to get ink to wash 100% out of the brush. You may get a little residue left in the brush, particularly if you're not quick to go and wash out every bit of the remains of it. Now, I don't want to risk my very expensive number 7 series 7 pure sable brushes with ink. I like to keep my very best brush just for the pure watercolour work. So although I'm using a similar size pure sable brush, I used a different one for the ink wash to what I've chosen to use for the watercolour wash. I'm using the Mameri Blue, which is an Italian brand, one of the world's best, if not the world's best watercolour. You can use any artist quality watercolour with permanent pigments. Permanence, that's another thing. A lot of artists aren't so worried about permanence these days. I'm always very concerned about it. The inks that I'm using are the Artemis archival quality or permanent inks. They have a range at the moment, I think about 21 colours from the store that I'm getting them from, and I'm going to get the full range gradually. They're costly inks because they're quality, and they'll often, the dearer quality will often work out the cheapest in the long run because they'll tend to go further. Inks are, there's basically 3 different major ways that they make inks. The main things you need to be concerned about is permanence or temporary or fleeting colours as an artist. If you are going to sell your work, you want to buy permanent ink. It's really not fair to your client to be selling them things that are going to fade. A lot of inks are dye based and dyes tend to fade. Rose Madder Genuine, beautiful, exquisite rose colour, that a lot of artists love. It's made from a plant dye and it fades. So no matter how beautiful it is, it's only beautiful for 6 months and then it starts to fade. Um, that's not integrity, to not study up on that type of thing. Make sure what you're working with is permanent. Uh, if you're purchase from a quality store that's got a good reputation, where they have people with knowledge about supplies and you can ask questions and you get recommendations. Read the fine print in the catalogues about your products. I'm very happy with this particular brand of paint because the ink flows well. It's not going to wreck my fountain pens and it's not going to deteriorate on my painting. So they're my priorities. It's not whether or not that's a beautiful pink or that's a gorgeous red, or whether that particular ink color breaks up and creates a pattern of varied colours within the ink mark. I'm not interested in those things. I'm interested in knowing, will that colour last? If I do a painting with it, if I spend hours or a week or so doing a painting, will it last? If I was to sell the work, will it last? Am I passing on something with integrity to my client? They're the important things when it comes to the inks. So you're looking for archival quality or permanence. Also, the other thing about this ink is with the permanence, if I do the ink drawing through the day and leave it to dry for a number of hours, by the evening when I do my watercolour wash over it, the ink isn't bleeding out. If I was to do the ink sketch and come in straight away with water on my brush, I could bleed that ink out a little bit. It's good to know how much you can get that ink to flow or not. If I was using a different type of ink, say a dye-based ink, the ink would not be permanent on my paper. When I put a watercolour wash down, even if it was a day later, the ink would still flow out and I wouldn't be able to do my watercolour wash over the top. So you need to find out all of this information about the ink that you're going to work with. So I'm working with, as I said, the archival quality permanent inks, and they're ideal for what I'm doing. So I'm working with the quality pens, ranging from the extra fine through to the double broad size. And I'm using pure sable brushes, but if I was painting with the ink, washing with the ink, I'd be quite happy to use a synthetic because I wouldn't want to put a lot of money, invest a lot of money into a brush, knowing that the ink could be building up in that brush if I don't get to it very quickly and really work very hard to get every last trace of the ink out. Now, maybe I bit off a tall order trying to do 3 paintings of the same scene and put them all into the one tutorial for you. But part of my doing that was to show you there's more than one way to do something. There isn't just one way. And also, it's not a case of my way is the only way. The only things I'm fanatical about, if you like, the only things where I think there should be a few guidelines or rules for you to follow is the integrity of your work, working with permanent materials that are not going to fade or deteriorate for your clients, and to work with safe materials that are not going to poison you. And this is where I'm doing this painting totally different to the others. I'm putting light down on top of dark. If you see, this is not a watercolorist technique. A watercolorist cannot put light on top of dark because the paint is transparent. So I've had to make an opaque paint here. I'm using nickel tartrate yellow, which is an opaque watercolor, or if you like, a gouache. It's actually sold in a tube as a watercolor, but it is technically also gouache because it's opaque. And this is allowing me to put the bright blossoms of the wattle down over the intense dark of the shadowy foliage where the foliage clump is in shade. So I have not used this technique on the 2 side paintings. The 2 side paintings are more purist watercolour. It's all transparent. But with this one, I'm using some opacity into the paint. So this is a technique an oil painter might get into, working with gouache with the watercolour, where you're able to put light over dark, not something that a watercolorist can normally do. A watercolorist doing the pure technique of transparent watercolor has to get everything just right tonally in the first place. They can't go in and make changes. I'm also working with a pure sable fan brush. This isn't just any fan brush. It was a fairly expensive brush, this one, but it would actually be very hard to do this technique using a hog hair hard fan brush or a synthetic one. You could do it, but the quality brush is better. When I pick up those paintings, can you see the ring reflection of the LED lights? Remember in my last painting, if you saw it, the social distancing swing where my light failed. It took me a long time to find just the right lighting setup for videoing my films, and I discovered this lovely 19-inch LED light which shines straight down over my painting. It's just ideal for my work. It does reflect off the surface, so you're able to see what I have when I lift up my painting. Now, in all this time that I've been working with the watercolour wash, I stopped looking at the photograph and I've just been looking at my initial sketch, my painting if you like, and asking my painting what does it need. I've not followed the photograph at all, and I've broken away from the photograph now. I have looked at the composition. The Boots Gully sign, I think, was the major point of focus. I mean, it does stand out. The secondary point of focus is the boots. But if I painted them in the colour of the boots, which were greys and browns and some rather dull, dirty colours, they would not have stood out at all. Well, whatever was I thinking when I started this painting? I don't know why I didn't realise that if you put 3 paintings into one tutorial, it takes you 3 times longer to complete the work, even if the works are similar. But I'm having fun doing this, and I'm trying for a little bit of caricature in this painting. I have never caricatured a landscape. I've caricatured people and dogs. This is the first time I've broken away from an impressionist or a romantic realist look with a landscape, and I have stopped looking at the photograph entirely, and I'm trying to get a quirky nature. I mean, the whole idea of Boots Gully, where people have gone and hung their boots on the rail, it just appeals to me. So we have exaggerated, and I've tried to put the boots in colour, and you're seeing that back to front, I think. Well, that's the way it is, and I'm quite happy with the caricature effect that I got. It's quite a change from last week's work, which was a somewhat sombre theme of the lonely swing, the COVID distancing playground. These were a lot happier works, perhaps the ones where I did the pen work of the old rural farmyard, and I did the pen and wash. So I'm having a lovely time doing my Australian sketchbook, which has been predominantly pen and wash. But with this work, I had said that I was going to add gouache. Well, I have really let go with this, and I'm doing a lot of mixed media as I go towards the end of this painting. Because again, I start off with a plan always when I'm preparing to do a painting, but I always listen to the painting or listen to the muse. But I let it talk to me and let it suggest what to do. So I will be finishing off the smaller pair and going right into mixed media with it. And I've got that finished at this stage where I'm talking to you, ahead of showing you how I finish it. And then tonight, after I have completed the voiceover for this part of the video, showing you the finishing stages of the pair, I will be working on the larger work of the 3. And as I said, it has taken me 3 times longer. So a bit of bad time planning there. Please ask questions in the comments and I will strive to answer everybody's questions. If not in the comments, certainly in the next follow-up videos that I do. I popped the finished work alongside the work as I complete it, and I've titled it Quirky Australiana Boots Gully. Now, this is in the Central Highlands of Victoria. There's a lot of gullies. In fact, I'm in one. It's called Gully. I got to find out a lot more of the history of the place. I'm very keen to do that once this social distancing is over and it's okay for people like myself to go out. I'll be looking up as many historians as I can and be able to include a lot more stories of the local area. But this gully is predominantly wattle, which I'll have coming into bloom. The lovely golden wattles are my favourite. This, I think, is the Cootamundra and the black wattles. A lovely story. Well, I think it's lovely behind the black wattles. They are prolific in many of these areas, and a lot of the fact that they are so prolific is because the early settlers tried to burn them out because the cattle couldn't graze on the black wattle, so they burnt them down. And of course, our trees in Australia are regenerated by fire, many of them, the wattle in particular. The heat of the fire cracks open the seed pods, so if you put a fire through a wattle gully, it just comes back with denser wattle than before. So that's the reason why we have these wonderful pockets of wattle through our bush land. It's usually an indicator that we've had some fires have gone through. All the fine branches were put in with an extra fine pen. I've also used a very fine brush dipped into watercolour paint, a rigger brush, for doing fine work where I wanted to use a different colour to the black in my fountain pen, where I've used brown. I've actually ordered extra fountain pens today. In the last couple of weeks I've been building up my fountain pen supplies because I'd like to have brown paints, brownings in different colours, and also greys. Some of the green greys would be just lovely to have in fountain pens. So I've been putting together a bit of a collection. Here I'm putting the opaque paint, the gouache, on with a fan brush, that soft sable fan brush. You can use a nylon if you don't have a lovely soft sable brush to do that with. You could use a hog hair, but you'll find the softer the hair is, the easier it is to apply very soft, subtle brushwork. If the brush is harder, as in a hog hair fan brush, which are easy to obtain, you'll find the line will also be harder. And the advantage of the pure Kolinsky sable brush that I'm working with now is that it will carry a large amount of your paint or water if you're laying down water. And that's the advantage of paying for those expensive pure sable Kolinsky brushes. I'm using a gold nibbed pen. Now, the advantage of the gold nib pen over a steel pen is if I press extremely lightly, I'm getting an extra fine line with this extra fine nib. However, I push a little bit harder. You do have to be careful because you don't want to damage your pen nib. But where I want a fine line rather than an extra fine line, see, I just put down one now. That line was darker than the previous lines that I put down. There is more flexibility in the gold nib, and therefore it's like a brush to some extent. I can vary the width of my line. You can actually get a flex nib, which will vary it even more, from say a fine line through to a double broad line. Again, you need to be careful. You don't go lending your fountain pen if you have a quality one like this, because everybody use of the pen is different, and the pen will adapt to your use, and you become familiar with its characteristics. And if somebody else uses it, they can change the nib, change the shape of the nib, and the pen will then start behaving differently. So if you're an avid fountain pen user like I am, it might pay to have an inexpensive fountain pen in your kit so that when somebody wants to borrow a fountain pen to try, you can hand them the less expensive one and just protect those gold nibs if you've invested in them. and you just want them to be a tool that you know exactly how it's going to work when you pick it up. I'm able to work on these quirky and rustic rural scenes thanks to Daryl Rain. He's from Limpede in the Ballarat area of Victoria, and he's got a day spa and a little business where he also sells jewellery and collectibles. And he's got an eye for it's I can't get out because I'm a senior and I'm living in assisted living aged care and we have to protect the whole community here. So of course I've been in lockdown for months. It's not too bad because I've got wonderful views. I've got panoramic views from my room. I laugh and say that I live in a penthouse, but I certainly live in a wonderful rural setting. And there's lovely gardens which have got native plants plus ornamentals. So I'm certainly not short of material to paint. But Daryl Reed has a wonderful eye for the sort of subject matter that will make great artwork. So I'm hoping you're enjoying my Australia sketchbook, and it's thanks to Daryl Reed, who is helping me get my material to complete it. Well, I've enjoyed painting this rather quirky Australian bush scene, and I've got a wonderful range of new pens, both vintage and modern, coming, and lots of different coloured inks and art supplies that I want to show you. So next week I'm going to paint for my other channel, my Still Life channel, that beautiful arrangement of jonquils with brass bowl and China painted plate. So join me on my other channel and the link will be below if you want to catch up with that still life painting, or just stay with this channel if your interest is for the beautiful landscapes and this sort of quirky kind of rural rustic scene, and I'll have fun showing those to you and the art supplies. These three paintings were painted in permanent fountain pen ink, artist watercolour, and artist quality gouache, and they took me about 9 hours to paint. Tell me what art mediums you would like to see demonstrated next.